completely was, I worshipped the altar of Dominick Dunne. What was he like as a father?
Well, there was almost 2 or 3 different fathers. When I was a little boy, my father was a very different man he became at the end of his life. He was very obsessed with celebrity, social, having famous people to his home. He was a great entertainer. His priorities in life were somewhat shallow, and as a child, it was like, he'd make us wear matching clothes, and he was very kind of dictatorial about everything that looked and how it looked. And he was actually very influenced by raising us like as if we were the royal family. And, we would actually have Christmas cards that were taken of us in suits, no smiles. And he said it should be like Cecil Beaton's portraits of the royal family. So it was that kind of a vibe. But as, his life started to fall apart, and his career. He was a television executive and then a movie producer. But it really started when my mother had enough of this kind of living and didn't want to, go out every night. And, she wanted to eat at the table with her children, because we only ate in restaurants if we did eat as a family. And when she left him, even though he was, closeted man, he was deeply in love with her and devastated. And he called her, his wife, to the end of his life. And it was then that everything that he treasured, all of his belongings, he went broke. They were all taken away. He had a yard sale, putting tags on all of his precious endirons and rugs and everything. And the people that, were kicking him when he was down on the business came to haggle with him. And then he drove to Oregon, only because his car broke down in front of a cabin, and got sober and reinvented himself and kind of came to terms with who he was and the kind of man he wanted to be. And I'm sure we'll, and then tragedy and a brutal experience in the injustice that we all witnessed as a family transformed him at great cost to find his voice as a writer. And that's why he became that journalist you admired.
The amazing journalist. So let's talk about that injustice, because if I remember correctly from the book, it was your sister, your little sister, Dominique. There was 3 of you, Alex, and Dominique. It was Dominique that your father confided in about being closeted. Is that right?
That's correct.
So how old was she when he started talking to her, and why was it her that he confided in?
She was, my mother had not an easy road. And she lost 2 children between my brother and I. Each one was brought to term and died after a day. They were both girls. And so when when Dominique was born, it was like, oh my God, I finally got my little girl. And she was just treasured. And, very bossy little thing, who always knew who she was. And my brother and I was always pleasing her. And she was the light of my father's eye. They just had a relationship that was so close. And she was the one who brought a friend of hers, an older guy who was an artist, a guy named Norman, to help put the tags on the endirons and run interference so he wouldn't have to haggle over his belongings. And right in front of Dominique's eyes, she saw these 2 men fall for each other. And she thought it was hilarious and lovely and touching. And she never told us. I never knew about this. He confided in her because she knew how to keep a secret, even from her brothers. And this guy, Norman, he became, the first time I ever saw him, he was a witness at a murder trial. And then in the last year of my father's life, he was having stem cell treatment in Germany. And I flew there, and I knock on his door. I'm in the room next door to see him, and he's in a hotel. And this guy opens the door, and it's Norman. And I find out they've been together for over 40-something years. And, we sit, Dad is very, he's, lost a great deal of weight, and he's kind of going in and out of sleep. And Norman to the bed, splitting a bottle of wine, and he says, I know everything about you. I know when you got kicked out of school. When your mother had MS, your father, sorry, your father cried to me and wept, but you know nothing about me, which is true. So yeah, that was the secret Dominique kept.
Why do you think that was? Why didn't your dad tell you about him?
Well, we as kids, our parents had so many gay friends who were couples that we grew up knowing them as couples. So being gay was hardly a monumental turn of events for anyone. I think his background, he was Catholic. Being gay, you're filled with shame that's ingrained. He had a father and beat him with a belt. And he was just a little boy who loved movies and could quote Dark Victory and do Betty Davis imitations. And, his brothers were jocks. And I think it had a built-in shame and a secret. And I don't think he was ever really comfortable talking about it. And I wasn't uncomfortable talking about it, but I just sort of didn't feel like having that conversation either for some reason. I think it was just the time of which he was born.
Yeah. Now, you say how your father was shallow in loving the celebrities who came to the house. I have to admit, I'm just as shallow because I love reading about them. And the celebrity who really stood out to me, I'd be interested to know the one who stood out to you as a child, is your dad through this incredible black and white ball ahead of Truman Capote's. In fact, Truman Capote's was inspired by Dominick Dunne's black and white ball at the house. And Truman came to the ball, but then didn't invite your father to his ball, which is the most Truman Capote thing I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah.
Who was the celebrity who stood out to you as a child? There's so many amazing anecdotes from your childhood.
Well, the part of the problem was I was so young that all the people that came to our dying to talk to us, I understood movies and wanted to be in them. Billy Wilder and George Stevens and David Niven and, a young Dennis Hopper, Warren Beatty. They would all, come to our house, and I was too young to really acknowledge them. There was one guy named Ivan Moffat, who my brother and I used to make so much fun of as a grown-up. And he would smoke cigarettes, and the ashes would get on his face. You're going to like smoke like this all the time. And my brother and I used to imitate him. And, well, he turned out to be one of the photographers with George Stevens that liberated the Auschwitz camp, and in a lonely place. A place in the sun. Like, God, I wish I knew that. The one that really made where it was like, oh, that guy's famous. I idolized him was Sean Connery, who was swimming laps in our pool at a lunch party. And I was kind of surprised to see he had a bald spot on the top of his head that he didn't have in the movies. And in an effort to impress him, I jumped in the deep end. I'd never been in the deep end, but I thought it was a good time. And Sean will be blown away by this. I sunk like a stone. And I was surprised how little, I'm looking up like a Hockney painting, upside down. And no one noticed that I was under and having a very hard time getting up. And I felt this hand on my rump just lift me up and then put me on the side. And he said, "A wee bit early for the deep end, sonny." That I remember.
I love, reading the book, particularly the first half. It's like reading Zelig of the famous people of the mid to late 20th century. Even your mother's dating life after your father leads to the FBI coming to your house. Can you...
Well, shortly after the Pentagon Papers came out in the Post and the New York Times, my mother dated Daniel Ellsberg.
Who leaked them. And he was number one on Nixon's enemies list. It's like dating Julian Assange. basically.
Yes, right. But I thought Daniel was a little more handsome. And so he was, on the enemy's list. There was the White House, the Watergate plumbers broke into his shrink's office to get papers. The FBI was all over him on Nixon's orders. And so they canvassed anyone who had anything to do with Daniel Ellsberg.
So your mom dated him, obviously.
That was, my mom dated him. But he was kind of a playboy. So, so one day the FBI came by the house. And my friend Charlie and I, we answered the door. They showed us the badge, and they wanted to see my mom. And so she was in the sitting room, and we brought her in, and we eavesdropped. And it was a very thorough investigation. Where did you meet Mr. Ellsberg, and how much did he tell you? And she said, I talked about my children. I think I bored him silly. There's nothing I have for you. And from that day, we would notice clicking in our phone. And so Charlie and I would pick up the phone and go, what do you think your wife is doing right now while you're listening to phone calls of teenagers? What kind of a person are you? Yeah.
So I'm to go to a sad
Sure.
time, but so we were talking about Dominique, and at this point you were in your mid to late 20s, she was in her early 20s, and you were both acting pretty successfally, both of you.
Yes.
Your father must have been thrilled.
Thrilled.
To have his children get the cinema success that he'd always wanted. And you'd been in American Werewolf. Had you been in After Hours as well at this point?
No, not at this point.
Not at this point. Dominique had been in Poltergeist.
Yes.
And then she was murdered by her ex-boyfriend.
Correct.
Do you want to tell the story? I don't want to be
Sure,
speaking
no. So Dominique, when she decided to become an actress, I was, I was kind of still struggling and, having a hard time. And I said, oh, honey, don't be an actress. It's the worst. It's the worst. And she said, I'm going to be an actress. And we're going to be, a sibling couple. We're going to be the Bridges. We're going to be the Lunts. We're going to be, and I think a month later, she was on a soundstage in her first job, which was called a TV movie called Diary of a Teenage Hitchhiker. And she was the teenage hitchhiker, #1 on the call sheet. I mean, they just saw it. People who met her just saw it. So we were greatly amused that both of us, our big breaks in movies were horror movies, because we really didn't follow horror movies that much. And so I did my movie, and then I went to see her on the soundstage that Steven Spielberg produced. And things were really taking off for her. And friend that, you always look back and you see signs, then, you sort of torture yourself about that for a while. But he had, into their relationship, as her career was taking off, he was the kind of guy he's a very large fellow. He was terribly threatened by her success, and kind of one of those kind of people that keep her away from her friends. And one night he strangled her, and she managed to escape through a window. And she raced in the car. She got in the car, he got on the hood of the car, and she screeched off. And she went to Norman's house, actually. And Norman had the wherewithal to take pictures of her neck. Which is why he was, which is why he was a witness. And so that was the end of Norman. That was the end of this guy. Put his suitcases out on the lawn. But on Halloween Eve, he went by her house. She was rehearsing with an actor for a shoot the next morning, and got her to come outside and killed her. Well, he didn't kill her for 5 days. And,
And the other actor just stayed inside, right?
And the other actor stayed inside, and left a message on someone's machine that if I'm killed, John Sweeney is the one who killed me. That was this guy's name. And so that, that's what happened. And really, and in the book, when I got to that, I always knew, writing chronologically, I'd be getting to that. And so when that happened, I was seeing the headlights of this coming up, this book is going to take a turn because our family were never the same from this. This is the demarcation. It changed all of our lives. So I made it part 2 and just plowed through it. And through everything that followed was just one travesty after another. From the funeral, we went to make arrangements. We went to see a Monsignor who had christened Dominique, Alex, and myself for our first communion. He was drunk, and he scheduled Dominique's funeral and a wedding at the same time. So we had to wait, and then as the casket's being carried up, we're stepping on rice, and then the guy mispronounced her name all the way through, this Monsignor, and then the trial. And the trial was we call it, the first they kill your loved one, and then they kill her again in the courtroom. The defense attorney for the killer defense quite successfully in terms of the verdict, which came out to be a manslaughter, not murder, like a crime of passion, like it was some sort of Balzac novel or something, and he did 3.5 years. There was this guy that none of us knew had a history of violence against women, and this woman who was a previous girlfriend had been put in the hospital twice by him, and she was called as a witness, and this would have been the turning point, finally the one good day we'd have in this courtroom. And she was terrified to testify, but she bravely showed up, and before she was called, the judge dismissed the jury from hearing this testimony we were going to hear because he said it would be prejudicial. And they missed this horrific description of her broken eye socket and the killer rising from his seat as if to head toward her, and the bailiffs wrestling this guy and putting him in his chair. And they missed hearing the judge say, I know how difficult this is for you, Mr. Sweeney, which, we just looked at each other like, did we just hear that? And that, before we went to California, my father, brother, and I, we were in New York. He had met by chance. He went to a dinner, and Tina Brown was at this dinner, and he was sharing with her. Somehow he just immediately got each other. He said, she really saw me, and he's describing. He's telling about how scared he is about this trial and the effect it'll have on my mother, who had MS and was in a wheelchair, and she said, if you write down what you've gone through, I'll publish it. And he wrote this piece that was, quite honestly at the time, I didn't really appreciate it. It was too personal. And this whole episode, until I wrote this book, had been very personal. And but this was a groundbreaking piece about what a family goes through. And the result was my father he found his voice as a writer, and he became famous. Suddenly all these famous people are coming to him, and he's writing about the most famous murder trials. But he never let you forget about O.J. Simpson. He never let you forget about the Browns or the Simpsons, Nicole.
Yeah.
And if you vector, he'd remind you that Lana Clarkson, who he murdered, was not some fourth-rate actress as described in the press, but somebody's daughter. And it reflected in everything. And then my mother, far from getting sicker, became a victims' rights advocate and started a group called Justice for Victims of Homicide in California. And they changed laws that were to protect the victims. They're now in 23 states. And she was awarded given an award by George Bush Sr., President George Bush. So instead of, destroying us, that we feared, both my parents, and this was my compulsion to write this book, they they used what happened to our family, and my mother became indispensable for so many other families from all walks of life in California, and she was a remarkable woman.
And your father too. I mean, he changed how these kinds of crimes are reported.
Absolutely.
I don't like to put the spotlight on this person, but do you know what happened to John Sweeney?
Well, part of my journey was to kind of follow up and see where he was, and when he got out so quick. And we found out that he got a job almost right away as a chef, and he was a sous chef at a very popular restaurant before called Ma Maison, which, by the way, shut down as a result of this killing, and they hired an attorney to defend this guy, and that very popular restaurant went out of business. But we found out he got a job right away at a restaurant in Santa Monica, and we all had placards, and my mother was out there, and we had placards that said, "The hands that prepared your meal killed." Well, he lasted about a week, but I not to my mental health, kind of stayed with it, and sometimes I would find out that he had a girlfriend, and I would find out who the girlfriend was, and I would end that relationship. They would not know. He changed his name to John Mora, and one day Dad got a letter that came through Vanity Fair from this man. He's now out of the state to Seattle, and he said, my daughter, I saw your article, and the picture of John Sweeney looks just like John Mora. I wanted to know, and indeed, Dad could confirm it was, and the father could not get my daughter. Once he confronted her, he said, "Yeah, she knows who he is. He's so sorry. He'd never do it again." And I managed to get her on the phone, and I broke that one up too. And but and we had a detective, and my father was pretty obsessed as well. And then after a few years, I just thought, this is clouding my good thoughts.
Because I'm sure a lot of you remember. I remember when the O.J. Simpson trial happened, and I was in America at that time. There was a real feeling. I mean, people now, talk about O.J. Simpson like it's a given that he was guilty, but there was a real divided feeling and this attitude that Nicole, his wife, had been a slut and was sleeping with the waiter, Ron Goldman, who he was killed with, and, poor O.J. Simpson. And this was kind of presumed. And O.J. man, driven to this, a crime of passion, his evil, horrible wife had left him. And it was really your dad's reporting that changed that. I mean, people forget how powerful, glossy magazines actually had an impact back in the 90s, how powerful that reporting was. And now people don't talk about those cases that way, the convictions they should, or the sentences, but really magazines, media, they don't talk about the women who get killed the way they did before your dad stepped in.
Well, that trial in particular, every time he covered a trial, it took something out of him.
Yeah,
emotionally.
Sure.
He just didn't, and he didn't pretend to be, a well-balanced, biased journalist, and particularly about the OJ. And he was so emotionally invested during that trial. I thought he was going to have a heart attack. I thought he would get so. I would say, I think you're endangering your health, Dad. You should not be doing this. And of course, he continued. And that verdict, when it was read on live television, I was in New York and I saw it. And the camera panned, and I saw, the expression on his face, you know, it just broke me.
Sitting with the Goldman family.
With the Goldmans, yes.
Yeah, yeah. Who I interviewed years later was with them during O.J.'s parole hearing when he was convicted.
Yeah.
And they spoke about your dad and how much he had really been like a kind of life raft to them. Also knowing that he knew what they were going through.
Well,
just
that's the
made
thing.
All the difference.
And, you know, I work with families as well, more from the gun violence prevention. And so I've become quite close with several, with a family of Sandy Hook, their child was killed, and with from Aurora, and I've become very close with them through, and I made PSAs, but, you know, they talk to the same dog whistle. It's like, as soon as we look at each other,
Yeah.
you know, we know it.
Yeah. Now, in contrast to, while your family is going through this, your career is taking off. But what impact on you psychologically? I mean, those are two very big things happening to you at the same time. First, you're becoming famous on your own. Secondly, you've lost your beloved sister. What do you think the cumulative effect of these very psychologically confusing things was?
Well, it was incredibly confusing, and guilt was a huge factor. My, you know, was you know, my mother's you know, health was declining, and you know, we were you know, her loss. I was becoming very successful, and, you know, starring in a Martin Scorsese movie in every frame of the movie, which I also produced. Which was a joyous experience, you know, and but it was you know, at the Cannes Film Festival with the movie. And God, the movie was like loved. You never saw a standing ovation like that. And I was by myself. There was a time when Gaddafi was threatening to kill every movie star going to Cannes. So if you thought you were a movie star, you weren't going to go to Cannes. And called because Schwarzenegger and Stallone didn't go. I was called the bravest American on the front page. And then they showed this movie, and it, you know, this. Incredible love coming down, and you know, a night of celebration. It was almost like too much candy or something. And I got back to my hotel room, and all I wanted to do was call my mom. And you know, we were on the phone, and I just said, you know, she might have had a movie in competition with my movie, you know, and you know, missed each other. And I've always had...
Sorry, it was After Hours.
After Hours,
Yeah,
sorry, yeah. And so you know, I had a funny relationship with success, and whenever I continued to produce and act, I only finally got a part as an actor because I had to produce a major motion picture for a studio that I gave myself a small part in. So I continued to produce and act and produce. And so whenever... I felt the, you know, attention or the glare and having to decide what's the next movie. Or gratefully just go behind the camera to work and become his producer, Lasse Hallström. And, you know, I produced some really great movies. I always understood a story, you know, be it a newspaper article or a book, far better than I understood, you know, how to manage my own ambitions as an actor. You know, there's some people, Tom Hanks, and they're like the CEOs of their, they know what to do, one thing leading to the other. I never knew myself that well like that, and I always felt very unformed. I don't think I would have handled celebrity that well, so I had no problem shying from it.
Do you think that's why you ways of turning down movies that became successful, like Sex, Lies, and Videotape, and choosing instead a movie like Who's That Girl?
Yeah, thank you.
I like both of those movies.
Yeah,
so,
yeah, no, I know. You know, people who love Who's That Girl are very upset. I just gave it a one line, and yes, I think it was. I mean, Sex, Lies, and Videotape was a heartbreak because I was in pre-production with Dustin Hoffman, who I have so much karmic energy with him of how I became an actor. He somehow intersects, without me even knowing him, in so many ways that led to me coming to New York to be an actor. He was starring in this movie with Lasse Hallström, and they were paying him like a ridiculous amount of money, and we had a very close relationship. And it was always like was famous for bolting from movies at the last minute, and I was the linchpin keeping him in. And I thought if I would have to do the movie, Sex Lives, I would lose this, and I had a commitment, so I just followed my commitment. And they cast the movie, and then she calls me up and goes, "Hey, listen, I got to talk to you about something. You know the Merchant of Venice?" I went, "Well, not personally, but yeah." I goes, "Yes, so, Peter Hall, he's going to direct the Merchant. I'm going to play Shylock." I went, "Okay, when?" "Well, that's the thing."
Yeah.
Anyway, he withdrew.
And it was the James Spader part.
It was the James Spader part.
Yeah,
who won Best Actor in Cannes. Just keep talking about it.
Do you think there's a part of you, though, that would have found that? I mean, that really would have rocketed you to the spotlight at a very difficult time in your life.
Yeah, well, I think I kind of dreaded spotlight and during a difficult time.
Yeah.
You know, and that the past would inform the present in so many different ways. You know, there was another movie that the director really wanted me for very much, and we're having dinner, and I remember Warren Beatty was the producer, and he was there, and this director, who's since been canceled so many times, it's ridiculous, this director, James Toback, I guess in an effort to impress me or somehow just small talk, said how he was friends with a mobster and was going to have a great friend of his wife murdered. And I listened to that, and I got up to use the bathroom, and then I came back, and I said, "Did you tell that story to impress me? Do you think I would be fucking impressed by that?" And, walked off that picture, too.
And fair enough, I would say.
Oh, absolutely. But
also,
I mean, yeah.
I mean, also, you had a roommate earlier
who
very much suddenly was dropped in the spotlight. And did that also make you wary? And that roommate, incidentally, was Carrie Fisher, who was cast in a little movie while they were starting together that Carrie was sure would be a big flop, called Star Wars. So Griffin was right on the edge of that as well. So what was that like to watch her go through that?
We were incredibly close, and we were struggling, and
so close. Can I say this? You took
yeah. It's on public record.
That you took her virginity. Yeah.
She asked me to. She had a boyfriend. She didn't want the boyfriend to know she was a virgin. And I relieved her of her hymen, and it didn't affect our friendship at all. We were close. I did her a solid, and. So she said, she tells me she gets this part in this movie, and she does indeed think it's pretty stupid. And she would call me from London, waking me up in the middle of the night. I go, "Oh, you're so lucky not to be in this movie," as if I had any chance. You should see what I look like, what I'm wearing. I have 2 bagels on the side of my head, and we're running down hallways with ray guns with no triggers, and there's this big monkey that follows us, and there's a little guy in a trash can, and it just rolls over. This is going to be such a flop, this movie. And so what happened, as we know, we went to the screening for the very first showing ever of this movie, and it was very apparent. It was, going to change not only the movie business, but Carrie's life and inadvertently my life. And, I was still a waiter at a restaurant called Beefsteak Charlie's in New York. And, suddenly I would, be coming home. Carrie's mom insisted we live in a doorman building. That's how we became roommates.
Carrie's mom being Debbie Reynolds.
Debbie Reynolds. Yeah. The doorman started to call me Mr. Fisher. And I would come home, and I'd be counting my quarters on my thing, and there would be, James Taylor crying to Paul Simon that Carly Simon's going to leave him. And, every rock star admired, at this house. And I felt like, I was just the roommate, and I wasn't, it just wasn't my time. And it reminded me of like when I was a kid with all these, that wasn't my time, and it wasn't my time to be there. So, I moved out, and, we took a break from each other for a year or so, and I started to work. I needed that, inner security to feel validated, and then we fell right back to where we were.
The weirdest thing about you and Carrie being roommates during Star Wars story is the other star of Star Wars, of course, was your aunt's former carpenter,
yes.
Harrison Ford. Was that weird at the time? So in case you don't know, Harrison Ford was Joan Didion's carpenter when they lived out in Malibu, I think.
Correct.
Is that right? Yeah.
Correct.
Did you think about that? Like, my roommate is making a movie with my aunt's
Well,
former
that was one of the
carpenter?
most upsetting things to me because I knew Harrison, and he was a carpenter, and I would help him on the deck, but I idolized him. I never saw a guy so charismatic and funny. And when he broke off Marlboro Red cigarettes, the filters off, I broke off the Marlboro cigarettes. And when he smoked a joint, I would take a hit, and I'd be on the thing trying to help, and then I couldn't tell what a saw looked like. It was the strongest pot ever. But I was very envious that she gets to work with this incredible guy.
Oh, so you were jealous of her getting to work with him, being with her. You had the crush on him rather than the crush on her.
Absolutely.
And how did your friendship with Carrie change over the years? Because obviously her life had its own challenges.
Well, she in New York, and when we were together, we were like a two-man crew, and I was also the sort of the buffer between her and every man and young person, anyone who met Carrie, fell immediately in love with her, and they try to get to her through me, and I, and they say, Carrie said to me, we kissed, and then she said, see you next Wednesday. What does that mean? And we think, she just baffled guys, and they were just so in love with her. And but as she, her universe expanded, of course, and I became one of, she had several who are very good, best friends of mine. And when she died, there was 5 of us on this text chain that started the day she died, that started off grief-stricken, and then Carrie joined the thread, became hilariously funny and irreverent, and we were just channeling Carrie.
Now, you've got so many amazing parts to your life, Griffin. As I said, you've got the movies, your family, your dad, your aunt, Carrie. When someone approaches you, can you tell which part of your life they're going to want to talk? That's definitely a Joan Didion person. He looks like that. That's Dominick Dunne person.
Not necessarily, but I've been to horror cons, and
yes.
if I see someone dressed as me with my throat ripped out, I go, I think I know what they're going to want to talk about.
People start talking to you about your aunt, because obviously she is such a cult figure for so many of us.
Yeah, I think like very soon after Slouching Towards Bethlehem came out, she was the first famous person I was ever related to.
I think your father to that comment.
Well, he wasn't. He wasn't
no,
famous.
But he was proximity to famous.
Yes, that was as close as he got.
Yeah.
He didn't do anything that made him famous.
Sure.
Except give great parties at that point in his life. But there was like a billboard on the Sunset Strip of Joan and Slouching Towards Bethlehem, and as I was a teenager, other teenage girls would find out I was related to Joan, and that worked very well too. But I mean, it was, people were in awe right from the moment that book came out. And she became, really, really famous, but she always, both she and John, her husband, John Gregory Dunne, my uncle, was also a great, great journalist and novelist, and they were obviously a very close couple who edited each other's work. Even when
wrote movies together.
And wrote movies together. Even when Joan would be writing about, I'm thinking of divorcing my husband, she'd hand it to John to edit. So, they were an incredible couple. And as my father's life fell apart in the 60s, which is a very specific time in, Hollywood history, is before Easy Rider came out, and all directors who had their heydays in the 40s and the 50s and the 30s, that movie just really, they became people who accepted Lifetime Achievement Awards, and the world kind of passed them by, and it went on to another generation, and that was my aunt and uncle, who were also very, very social, but, very accomplished as writers. They would entertain, the greatest filmmakers of the 70s. And there would be, Spielberg and De Palma and Robert Towne, rest in peace. Today, I just saw he died. Paul Schrader. And they would always invite me to these things. They always had from a very early age, they just thought I was just a precocious, funny kid. And I would go to their parties all the time.
One of the saddest and most shocking things I found in your book is how your aunt found for Dominique's trial. They fled to Europe. And you say in the book that they were trying to protect their daughter, Quintana, because they were worried that she'd be called as a witness. Can you explain why they were protecting her? What was going on in that family dynamic?
Well, before that family dynamic was a very toxic relationship that went back 20 years between my father and his... And even to the point where, John didn't even believe that his older brother was beaten by their father. But they were very, very close when John came to Los Angeles with Joan in 1960. Great, close friends. But when Dad's career and the drinking and everything, his life fell apart, he always felt, and John and Joan became very, very famous, and were doing what he did, and he didn't feel it was reciprocal, and he was quite bitter about it. And he also, if you ever want to destroy a relationship, borrow money from a family member, and that created tremendous resentment. When the trial happened, John and Joan were right to think that Quintana, their daughter, might be called. She, was kind of a wild child, and Dominique was her babysitter when they would go away on location. And, she partied very hard, and Dominique would have to find out what party she was in and drag her out. But it was taken, it was a season of madness on our parts, both crazy and mad. And my father really believed as well. He knew how this would happen, and he was trying to do back deals to get a plea bargain. That didn't go through, and Dad even resented that toxic relationship. So, so when they left, they became a source of anger. You just got to put your anger somewhere. I was always Switzerland. I was in the middle. I loved them both, and for years afterwards, tried to, be friends again, and it always blew up in my face. But in the last year of John's life, it was very tiring to be in the middle of all this. And then one day, Dad goes into, both men had heart attacks. He goes into his cardiologist's office, and they never knew they had the same cardiologist. So they pick up magazines that are pretending to read, and they look across from each other. And I don't know who said it first, but they went, "What the fuck are we doing? What? Life is two friends." And they talked on the phone every day. Matter of fact, I was on John's morning call. He would always call several people. I got bumped. And he called Dad instead. which I was totally fine with.
Now, I'm sure most of you have seen Griffin's wonderful documentary about his aunt, The Center Will Not Hold, on Netflix. How did that come about, and how was it working with someone you're so closely related to?
Well, in typical Joan fashion, she asked Sonny Mehta, who was her publisher, chief of her publishing company, to ask me to direct a video of her final book, Blue Nights, which is used as a promotional thing to sell books. And they're usually, if you've seen them, they're kind of cheesy. And I said to Sonny, I'd like to do one, but for more money than you usually spend. And he said, okay. And so we made this like short film that, with Joan, who had one time wanted to be an actress. She loved getting in the car with this young crew, and we go to locations, St. John the Divine, the Botanical Gardens, and we had a ball making it, and it came out great. And so I thought I'd push my luck, and I knew she'd been asked so many times and turned down so many other filmmakers to make a doc. I said, what do you think about making a feature? I really think we could, what do you think? And she went, okay. And I was off and running. I had a tremendous burden of, satisfying both her passionate readers who take great ownership, but, I also wanted to expand her readership to a younger generation. Mission accomplished.
Yeah, totally. And for a younger generation, they really got to know your aunt, which is about when John, her husband, who she adored, suddenly died. And then Blue Nights, which is her saddest book, is about the death of Quintana. Can you tell us a little bit, because Joan doesn't really talk about in her books what it was, because she sort of alludes to Quintana being troubled, but we never really understand what was
going on. When I was making the doc, it was the most difficult conversation to have with her on camera. It made me wish I was just some BBC reporter who had no relationship with her, instead of loving this woman, to ask about something so difficult. And what Quintana had, she was an alcoholic and had been struggling with alcoholism, and brutal alcoholism that began really when Quintana was adopted. And when John and Joan became famous, they would write about our adopted daughter Quintana, very pride. And John would say, when Quintana was in class, a little girl in like first grade, they'd say, what do your parents do? And they'd go around, and then she'd go, I was adopted. And then all the other kids said, I want to be adopted. And so she was always fine. But John and Joan kept a file of crazy people who would say, I'm the parent of Quintana. I'm the one who gave her up and all that. And they just put it in a file. And then one day, Quintana, she was now maybe 17, 18. She went and she came into the living room and went, this one seems real. And she was quite right, it was. And it was from a mother, Texas, a desperately poor mother, lived in a trailer park, and she flew there to see them and to see she had Quintana, and they were ravaged by alcohol and drugs, and they knew Quintana, like, how come she got this? And when she saw it, she wanted it in her life, and she invited one of her, birth brothers to New York, and he came and she gave a party for him, and she looked around and there was like Harrison Ford and all these things, and went, and he really laid it on her, and then the family would just messed with her. Just, she couldn't, the drinking, she saw where she was from, and the drinking, she had that gene, and it came at her ferociously. She had a very long decline in her life, and it was very difficult. That book, Blue Nights, is brutal. Herself as a mother. Yeah. And, people who loved her, some people, a good friend of our family is a guy named Earl McGrath, who Joan had dedicated 2 books to. he said, I hate that book. I hate every word of that. You know, your mother was, and she was a good mother.
Yeah.
But, you know, you're not supposed to outlive your kid.
No, no. Was that one of the hardest things you've worked on, that documentary? Because it was towards the end of your aunt's life, and you were talking about some of the most painful moments in your family, including your father and your uncle's fallout with Joan.
I would say it was the most rewarding thing I've ever done in my life.
Mm-hmm.
It's the thing I've done that I'm most proud of.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. Mm-hmm. When it was shown at the New York Film Festival in Alice Tully Hall, the biggest theater, you know, Joan was in a wheelchair. She was quite frail. And the filmmakers are on a balcony, very elevated, looking down on the crowd. And it gets this thunderous standing ovation, and a spotlight hits us. And I wasn't sure. The railing is really low. And I was thinking through the entire movie, how am I going to get her to stand up, and what if she falls over? And so I decided I'm not going to push my luck. And so I stand up, and she goes, "Get me up!" And so and we just stand there, and the glow is for her. It went on forever. And, you know, I thought what I'm proud about is, like, you know, writers see their audience. They were cheering for her life's work.
Yeah.
You know, writers don't get to do that, and I got to do that for her.
Yeah. Now, I'm getting signal that it's time for questions from the audience, so don't be shy. I'm sure all of you have many questions for Griffin that I've neglected to ask. This lady right here.
It's a really quick question, but I have to ask you. So when you were in American Werewolf in London, can you share a little bit about it, your time working on that film? And was that your first time in London?
So the question is, can Griffin share a little bit about his time working on American Werewolf in London, and was it his first time in London? Excellent question.
I've been in London before with my brother and sister and mother. My mother, after her divorce, took us to all around Europe. It was her life dream to show us Europe. The next time I was there was to be starring in a movie. That was a first. And I remember, you know, we flew the Concorde plane, and I sat next to this absolutely beautiful woman, a bit older than me, and we flirted all the way over. And you know, as we're approaching the baggage claim, I kind of wanted to ask, "Where are you staying?" And the door flies open, the things open up, and there's a wall of paparazzi. Miss Collins, and it was Joan Collins. So that's how it started, and it was an incredible time. It was you know, to be in England. Margaret Thatcher was president. There was Brixton riots. There was tremendous racial tension and strikes. But there was also the Clash and Sex Pistols, and it was just wild and dirty and crazy. I loved it, and I loved doing this movie. You know, it was just, I didn't like putting on the makeup for 4.5 hours, but I really loved the whole experience. And you know, I remember we were engaged, and John dedicated the movie to Charles and Diana.
Next question. This lady right here.
Will you be signing on to do Practical Magic 2?
Will Griffin be signing on to do Practical Magic 2? Another very good question.
Well, it turns out I'm a guy, and they're never going to hire a guy to do that movie now. It was a time where, you know, this movie was so female driven, and I felt very comfortable in that with that story. I cared less about the magic and the witches than I did about the women and the generations of women. I really understood that. And that was, you know, what made it exciting to do. They are doing another one, and they've done other things. They never even contact me about it. You know, like, I read about it. Like, really? How do you think, why do you think there's people interested in continuing this? I read it again in the paper, like they're doing it. And just as I'm about to lose my shit on the producer, and she beats me to it and says, "Will you executive produce it? And we need your input." And finally, I got the you know, respect and love I was hoping for.
Next question, lady back there.
I listened to the audio version of the book. Oh, sorry. Hi, I listened to the audio version of the book and I loved it. My only complaint was that it ended fairly early in your life as far as memoirs go, and I'm wondering how you decided what a lot, and if you might do a part 2.
So why did Griffin end the memoir before he got to this point in his life, and will there be part 2?
All the way through, as I was writing chronologically, I was never really sure how it would end. And you know, at one point I was at page 300 and I was old. And you know, I know I have to bring this home sometime. And when I did the part 2 that I described, I took the night that the homicide detective, Dominique, was on life support, and I made that a prologue, because I realized Dominique was the pulse all the way through this. And so I'm going through the book, and I get to the part where my daughter's mother and our marriage, and I get to her birth, and you know, Carrie was cesarean, so I was given my daughter first, and I end it there. There's a reason why, and you know, it opened with, you know, death, and I ended with life.
You know, my question is, you describe so evocatively in that prologue and later the night of when your sister was attacked and then the immediate aftermath. Had you always remembered, you know, a lot of people might block out trauma, and writing then brings it out. How is it for you?
Well, I did remember it clearly, but just to sort of fortify my own memory, you know, my father's papers were at the Briscoe Center, which is in Austin, Texas. So I went to Austin and I ended all of his papers, and you know, the research that went into his writing his piece that was called Justice, that was the Vanity Fair piece. But I also learned things I didn't know that I put in the book, which was that when Norman testified, you know, he gave the most incredible testimony. He was the only ray of light. You know, there was a board up with the pictures of Dominique in her throat. And in one, there's a little, like she's got a little grin on her face. And the defense attorney's, when it's his cross, he's going, you know, if this is so terrible, why is she smiling in this? And he says very calmly, he goes, because the next day, she was going to work, playing the part of a battered housewife. And I said, before I took the picture, well, now at least you don't have to go into makeup. So they laughed, you know. Anyway, in the papers, we're all hugging Norman and so happy, you know, giving us the first way of hope. And Dad was so quiet. I remember he was like keeping off in the distance. And he was terrified that day that the defense knew about his closeted relationship, was going to bring him as a witness and say, you know, what kind of a man has a relationship with the daughter's friend? And he was terrified. He was terrified, and he wrote about it. And it broke my fucking heart.
One of the most extraordinary scenes in the book, speaking of your dad, is when you go to visit him when he's living on his own, and there's a man that he's seeing in the apartment where he's living, and you're unsure whether you're straight or not. You know, maybe you've inherited your father's sexuality, and so you decide to try to have a romantic thing with your father's boyfriend. It's like, no, don't even bother, Griffin. This one's not for you.
Yeah, that was the one I wrote that my editor said, are you sure you want to say?
Well, if you're going to try, who's safer to try with than your dad's boyfriend?
I had that. Yeah, well, also I just had this thing. I was scared. I thought, you know, I thought it was contagious, or there was a gay gene, or that I would be, you know, I was a young actor, I would be, you know, confined, which happens when people know you're gay, you're going to be stereotyped. And so I guess, you know, in this sort of crazy saying. I said, I'm going to find out. And he said, I'm afraid you don't have what it takes.
Are there other questions in the audience? Yes. This.
Arthur is my favourite film of all time, so thank you for that. It's a film I can watch endlessly and see new things each time it's brilliant. But famously, Tim Burton was going to direct it. How far did he get into production, and what do you think that person would be like?
So the question is, what would Tim Burton's After Hours have been like, and how far did he get into it until Scorsese took over?
Yeah, Scorsese first. Amy Robinson, was an actress in Mean Streets, his first movie, as a female lead, and she knew that Marty was the right person for it. But he was starting Last Temptation of Christ, so we thought, okay, well, that's not going to happen. So, by chance, we go to see this movie, and they had a short before the movie, like they used to in the 40s when they had in air-conditioned cinemas, But there was this brilliant animated short called Vincent, narrated by Vincent Price, about a little boy, Price, and the design of it. And then we thought, what about him? And we tracked him down. He was an animator, Tim Burton. He worked in the animation department, writing, drawing details that would be used among a desk of probably 50 desks in the room. And script, and already he was doing little drawings. So what I think, and these drawings, which you give any indication, was Paul Hackett, who looked remarkably like Edward Scissorhands, walking down hallways with bats flurrying around. But we tried to get it going. Tim had not only not directed a feature, he'd never directed a human being either. And so it was a tough sell. And then Marty, his picture, he was kind of in director's jail. King of Comedy was lost a lot of money. And then they pulled the plug on his movie in pre-production for Last Temptation of Christ, the first time he was trying to make it. And it was the first script he read on the flight home from Casablanca, and he said, we all had the same lawyer, and he called up Jay, and he said, what about this? I want to do this. And Jay said, Martin Scorsese wants to do your movie. I said, well, we're here for a year. Just, So we have begin this conversation with Tim. Well, funniest thing happened. You remember we gave it to Marty, and we're fumfering around, and he goes, wait a minute, are you saying Martin Scorsese wants to make this movie? Well, yeah, but we haven't said yes yet, but he goes, I respectfully decline. I will never do anything to step in the way of what he wants to do. And which is very classy. And we also knew we don't have to worry about him. We just knew. This guy we knew was brilliant. And Warner Brothers also thought he was brilliant, and they gave him, hired him for Pee-wee's Big Adventure about a month later. And that movie kicked our ass at the box office.
Is there another question in the audience?
I think just very briefly as well, you saying about one thing I loved in the book about Scorsese telling you not to have sex.
Yeah.
I think that was just absolutely great. If you could just kind of elaborate on that, because obviously building up the character and how he was so tense.
Yes.
That's amazing.
So the question is about Scorsese ordering Griffin to remain celibate ahead of filming.
A simple request. I think he got the idea from doing Raging Bull, how Jake LaMotta wouldn't have sex before a fight. He wanted me, he said, Griffin, I want you to be celibate for the 8 weeks of shooting. And I need you to have that look of just lust, and I just want to see your little mind thinking about this shit. And I said, yeah, no problem. And it was no problem for almost 7.5 weeks. And the weekend came up, and we were just finishing a scene with Linda Fiorentino where I'm massaging her, and it's just, she's scantily clad, and she has a little plaster on her thing that I'm picking off, and I'm just driven in a frenzy, but we have to wrap, and we'll pick up the scene on Monday. And something terrible happens over the weekend. But but I figured nobody's going to notice. But I pick up the scene on Monday, and I'm incredibly relaxed. And I'm just like massaging it, like I'm a really good masseuse. And like Pepe Le Pew, you know, I'm just like. And Marty goes, wait, cut. Griff, come here. Did you get laid? Oh God, Marty, I'm so sorry. You've ruined the whole fucking scene. You've ruined the movie. I got to rap. This sucks. I'm so disappointed in you. You fucked me. And I said, Marty, please, let me go back in. I can do this. And I went back in, scene picked right, because, you know, lust and fear look exactly the same.
Do we have another question in the audience? I'm sure after that we do. Okay, one and then two.
Can you say a little bit about This Is Us? I love
Thank you.
So the audience member asks if Griffin can talk a little bit about This Is Us, the TV show, series that he was in.
Yeah, you know, that was the least expected sort of opportunity that came my way. You know, I was asked by there if I would like to play this part of a man who had fought in Vietnam, who was in his mid-70s, who was, you know, suicidal, tremendous, you know, dealing with trauma and ill health. And I thought, mid-70s? But it was clearly an amazing. And what was so rewarding about it was, you know, I channeled my. It was easy for me to play. I channeled my father. My father was in a cabin in Oregon. RB, my character, he was suicidal. He thought about killing himself. Every day he would write about it, and he would write suicide notes. And he was struggling with alcoholism, but he was going to AA meetings. But anyway, in a terrible period in his life, and as it developed, it kind of mirrored my dad's life of finding himself. You know, just finding all this love. It was a great opportunity, you know. And every time I got the script, I go, God, that's so great. I mean, it would make me. I'm obviously a little weepy guy, but that show really killed everybody, didn't it? You know. So it was always a surprise of the growth and transition this character went through.
And your dad was a veteran. Something.
And
you
my
didn't
dad
really
was a
know
veteran.
about,
That's quite right. Yeah.
And
We'll go back to American World.
It's obviously it's high up in a lot of people's favourite films, and obviously it's got great special effects, it's really witty, it's got Jenny Ackles. I saw it. The thing that I think about is your relationship with David,
Yeah.
and the chemistry is amazing, and it's the sort of things I could watch at the 90 hours. And I just wondered if you have any, did you know that the chemistry was good? Did you have what was your experience of that?
so the question is, did Griffin know before seeing American Werewolf how great his David, his friend, was great?
Yeah, well, it's just a remarkable bit of casting that was based totally on instinct, on John Landis. I literally talked to him. I was dyslexic. I was always blowing auditions when I had to read off the page. So I was waiting for that. We just talked for about, I think, 15 minutes. He called and offered me the part. He had a guy stand outside to read the script, play the part of Jack. If I wanted to do it, hand the script back. Oh, it's an incredible part. God, yes, of course. And I never met David until we were all in Wales, pretending we were in Yorkshire. I don't know, we just picked it up. Like, John was like, he knew that guy would be good with that. And I think he saw in me, you know, a guy who could kind of be funny and look horrible at the same time.
Have you done any of those American Werewolf events? I think they're at Prince Charles Cinema. I've definitely seen John Landis do talks there.
I once did one years ago, and it was a nightmare. and it was like, I did it with John, it was fun. Then he left after he got a lot of cash. And then I had to deal with the $5 and you got change for the 10 for the autograph. And I wanted to kill myself then. But during the actors strike, I was asked again. And so I went to my very first one. And I was blown away by the effect that this had on people. I don't know why, I wasn't obviously in an emotionally secure place to appreciate the passion that this movie and how it affected people. And, so I did go to those, and I just see people. It's remarkable how many young people would say, "I saw this movie when I was 5 years old." Really?
20 times.
Yeah, 20 times.
We have 3 more minutes, I think. Oh, 1 more minute, sorry. 1 more minute. Do we have time? Do we have one more question? Very quick there. The great question. Working with Madonna in Who's That Girl?
It was really fun. It was crazy pants. There was like, as we said, I did grow up around famous people, and this was beyond fame. This was a world of pin-eyed, crazy people all around us, and lenses this long, always in our peripheral vision, and helicopters every time we were out. So we had to loop every scene out that was shot outdoors. She acted born for this, which I guess she was. She thought it was hilarious. She thought it was like, I thought it looked terrifying. It was just so intense, but we had a really, really good time, and I hadn't been in touch with her in some time, but we were friends for a long time afterwards. A really fun movie, and yet another movie that I happened to be involved in that nobody liked when it first came out, but then they liked years later. So
Sean Penn didn't give you a hard time during it, did he?
no, he did not. I think he was so grateful not to be in the movie.
And on that note, sadly, we have run out of time, but thank you so much, Griffin. This has
thank
been
you.
so much fun.